configuration where I could say, there's enough biomass here that would take what I would feel that I would have a realistic idea, because I was so intimately involved with gardening when I grew up, that I could look at this and say, okay, there's enough edible here to sustain me. And it's very unusual to find, like, let's say, half a dozen edible plants, of which some are ready to be used perhaps the middle of April.
And that doesn't provide you anything in fall, winter, and spring.
Yeah,
so it's a whole different mindset
you have to
and
set
knowledge.
aside enough to cover the rest of the year.
Mm-hmm.
So you're confronted with, how do you go about doing that with regard to drying and preserving.
And there's just this thing that people come by, this, I've been saying it now for a little while, practice, not purchase. You really got to practice and get all these skills down pat. You're lucky you were born with these skills and born into it. But those people that grew that garden that could sustain one meal a day for 365 days, I don't know if did that garden work out for them year one. It might have been quite the steep learning curve, or they had a lot of gardening background, but a lot of this is the years of practice and training before you can even make do of it.
Yeah, well then gardening is probably strictly gardening, and living as a vegetarian, it might not, a lot of people figured that the ideal way of eating is to eat everything as raw as possible. Those people find very quickly that the moment eating everything raw, that at a certain point they got to quit, because they're losing weight to the point where they can't sustain themselves eating raw. You got to cook in order to release a lot of the nutrients in the food. Well, then on top of that, you usually supplement that. Well, it makes sense right off the bat to raise chickens. Now you've got the challenge that you're going to have to grow enough feed for the chickens. And you've got to have feed that feeds them. So you didn't have a refrigerator. The moment that you need to put chicken on there, you go into the chicken run and catch one chicken and chop its head off.
Yep. Well.
And the trauma of taking the spirit away from a living creature that has 2 legs or 4 legs, that's something that's part of your livelihood. So the next thing is that the eggs and the chickens, but the feathers are not ideal unless they're from a goose or a duck. So we would grow a certain amount. The biggest challenge that in our socializing is the wedding. The weddings. You have to provide a pretty substantial wedding gift. Well, probably one of the most substantial one is to be the people that are in a position to make those pierinas, as they're called, a pierina. Which I guess I forget what you would call them. Duvet.
Like a duvet, goose down.
It's like half a, you got a good insulated bed, you pull this over you, and it's thick enough, even if the bedroom, if you wake up, a rim of ice is formed around where you're breathing.
Yeah.
Well, you can stay comfortable enough if you have a thick enough, that sort of thing. Well, to make one of those sort of things, you need a certain type of a feather, and that feather was best from a goose or a duck. And then on top of that, the issue is that there is the feathers that are small enough that you can actually strip. There's a shaft that you find that is bothersome because they try to poke through your whatever fabric you're using to enclose the feathers. Mm-hmm. But then you find that the feather, the soft, fluffy feather, the down, it compresses. So you realize that there's a certain mixture of these feathers that you have ripped off the two, and they curl up in a certain way, and you've got the right mixture. That's where you've got the that sustains its maximum loft, and so you do enough. There's certain times, maybe every few years, but when you can see that there's going to be a wedding, maybe today you would sort of maybe give money, buy something like a toaster or something. But for my mother's approach was to be ahead enough on those that the wedding gift from us would be that contribution to your being able to be comfortable.
It's a lot of naked geese cruising around your farm while wedding time.
well, there was enough geese that when you butchered the goose was a popular, like whatever the geese. Well, of course, the geese that come from it, the goose will. If there's a permanent slough nearby, they spend a lot of time there. A great deal of their forage, they can forage off of nature. Whereas chickens, you've got to grow a big enough patch of grain to keep the chickens going, either crushed oats or wheat. So the wheat patch now has to be big enough. So if you're going to keep pigs, you're going to have to grow enough oats, maybe a certain amount of oats and barley, and you crush that, and then you'd mix that with water into a kind of a thick porridge-like thing without cooking it, and that's what the pigs ate and sustained themselves. Plus the fact that they rooted the weeds out of the garden, and the milk that's left over gets recycled through the pig, and then the oats patch that you grew that sustains the pig, and then if you grow twice as many pigs as you need, then you had a market. You could sell pork as a ready income. So so on the farm you've got to have a certain amount of a surplus that contributes to you to have more cash to maybe buy a tractor or something. I don't know.
Or buy your stables. And that would be property taxes, insurance for your car.
Well, the cream was a very regular thing. Mm-hmm. So when you milk cows, but of course you can't go off on a holiday without someone staying back to milk the cattle, and so you end up being sort of tied to the land in some of those ways.
So, because you've grown up in that life, you currently live a very similar life. You have modern amenities, but you still grow a big garden. You still live very close to the property, off the property you live on. So, if you were to give a handful of key topics that a person, now air quotes, living remotely and wanting to live within nature, what are some of those handful of things that they would have to be proficient at? And that would be including having a wood-burning stove in their house.
Yeah, a piece of property is big enough to supply all the firewood you need to keep you warm and do your cooking. Mm-hmm. And then likely you're going to have a source of water. So when I moved here, the previous person that was on his way to, they were going to retire here. So he had a well dug and the power brought in. And so the well was there, and the power was already, just ready to be connected. It was already installed. And that's the reason, basically, that I acquired the piece of land, because the nearby neighbor, his uncle, was a mining engineer, and he had a sister living near here. So he decided when he would retire, he would live here. Well, they just couldn't find a replacement. He kept going back, and he ended up dying old age before he really. So he ended up with that payments on the installation of the power.
Oh, okay.
That the nephew inherited. That was the problem. That it was stretching his financial abilities. The annual charge for having the power installed in installments. So he put it up for sale. And like a silly person that I was, he figured that 20 acres, which I didn't realize was 3 acres, so I got 17 acres.
Okay.
He also offered me another 20 acres, and I thought, why should I do it? It would have been much better that had I could have, with little effort, acquired the other 20 acres. At the time, I would add 40, which would really be way more. I would have enough property now that I could make hay for the dairy cow and the horse or two that I could keep. But anyway, the whole intention of me living in the country is that I realize that a great deal of your income goes towards rent.
Mm-hmm.
So the quicker I'd acquire my own piece of land, and that made a big difference in my being able to live independently as a wilderness living instructor. I killed two birds with one stone. One is that I would live cheaply. Number two, then if people say, my credibility could be maintained by the fact that people say, oh, you must know what he's talking about, because he grows a big enough garden that he doesn't buy potatoes and carrots and cabbage, and he's got big berry patch, and I'm surprised that the apples that we can grow in our property, back in this type of environment, I always figured you'd be lucky to get crab apples. Now you're growing apples like this.
Wow.
And, if you said it's impossible to grow big apples like that, the mistake is don't believe what you hear, and, stuff like that. So the amount of apples that we can grow stretches my wife's ability to process all of them, either into apple juice or freeze apples for cooking apples as a dessert, and on and on. But between the raspberries and the apples and the Saskatoons, I had a fellow who I met many years earlier phones me one day, and he's a botanist, biologist, or whatever. He used to work at NAIT in that field, and he had a specialty in there are certain situations. In particular, the greater amount of his income was reestablishing areas in the native plants.
Okay.
Some government programs, that's what they seem to like, that farmland is being converted. They want that farmland to revert back to a natural state. What can you do to speed that up? And he phoned me and says, are you familiar with this type of huckleberry? And he, on the phone, is describing it. And I said, seems like what you're... He says, well, I found a patch of somewhere around Banff. Are you aware of... And I said, yeah, it's about 30 kilometers north of my place. Everybody goes there to pick that type of huckleberry, there was a few neighbors that were, it's kind of a lonely thing. You always try to talk someone else to go there picking with you. So you all go as a carload, and my wife was involved with another neighbor like that. And so we picked large amounts of huckleberries. So he said, could I hire you to pick me a bunch? And I said, sure, it'd be no problem. So I went out there. It was something I've heard. 4 ice cream pailfuls is what we agreed on. Well, he gave me like a dozen commercial Saskatoon bushes. And it's remarkable how many Saskatoons those bushes would provide. But it's remarkable how in this day and age there are birds that know that. And you've got to deal with the fact that they'll pick you've got to be out there. And I would try to screen the thing. You could buy this cheap screening from the Dollarama, but I couldn't keep up screaming them out. You'd almost have to, I put up what do you call those? A scarecrow, and I put a log, and I put a radio there, and I turned up the music.
They just enjoyed the music
they didn't. There's some of them were intelligent enough to figure out that that's no deterrent and whatever. But anyway.
So you figure if you had enough wood on your property to sustain your heat needs raw water, and you figure 40 acres of land if you were to just sustain yourself.
Well,
roughly.
Actually, probably 10 acres would be enough. But if you're going to include livestock.
Yeah.
So it happens.